All right, everyone. Welcome to Real Atheology. I'm your host, Ben Watkins. And my co-host, Ben, go ahead and say something.
I'm your co-host, Ben.
We've got to come up with something like you're Ben B and I'm Ben W or something.
Yeah.
We've got to come up with something. And well, anyways, we're joined today by Alex Malpass. Is
Hi.
that how you pronounce it?
I say Malpass, but yeah.
Malpass? Okay.
Yeah.
And we're going to do a little bit more discussion along the lines of the Kalam Cosmological Argument. So for those who don't know, our last episode was episode 19, and it was all on the Kalam Cosmological Argument. So obviously, Ben and I have listened to that episode. Alex, have you've listened to that episode as well?
I did. I listened to it like cycling into work this morning. So
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So what'd you think? How do we kind of want to kick things off?
It's not like I had like an objection or something to the way you guys were putting it, I suppose. It wasn't that I disagreed with you, but it's just because I'd been doing some work on the Kalam recently anyway, that I just thought I would drop you a line because we're friends on Facebook anyway. So I was just like, hey,
awesome.
I've been thinking about the Kalam recently. I don't suppose you want to chat about it sometime. So that was my motivation for getting in touch, I guess. So what I've been doing was working on a paper with Wes Morriston on developing a kind of dialectic that he's been having with Craig in print. They've got, I think, like 3 or 4 kind of paper exchange with each other where they're going back and forth over this particular issue. And we decided to sort of share the load and write a paper between the two of us, pushing it on to the next level of the dialectic, basically.
Cool.
So,
What's the issue?
Well, okay. The paper's in review at the moment at a journal. So I suppose I have to hope that it seems unlikely, I guess, but I have to hope that the reviewer of the paper doesn't listen to this episode, because then if he did, he would know it was me, and then it wouldn't be blind review and blah, 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 blah. So assuming that's not going to happen, I'll just explain the situation. So I guess it goes a bit like this. It's so let's see, how's the best way to recap the dialectic? So you guys were talking about this, I think. The way this argument runs is it's looking at the premise, which is that the universe began to exist. Right? And one of the supporting arguments that Craig offers for this is that a beginningless series of events is impossible. Right? And one of the reasons for thinking why that might be the case is that if there were a beginningless series of events, it would constitute what's described as an actual infinity or a completed infinity. Right? And Craig says that while those things are kind of acceptable in a mathematical sense, right, you can, in some sense, you can talk about set theory that deals with infinite sets. Nevertheless, you can't have something instantiated in reality that has those properties, right?
Would it be fair to say that that Craig's view is that we can have potential infinites, but we can't have actual infinites?
Yeah,
is that how he puts it?
That's the move that we're going to focus on.
Okay.
So the difference between, a completed infinity or an actual infinity is kind of there's a kind of classic straightforward definition for that, right? Which is something like it's a set where you can take a subset of that set, a proper subset of that set, and place all of the elements in that proper subset into a one-to-one correspondence with the original set. Right? So if you think about the set of the natural numbers, and then you take a proper subset of that, which is like the even numbers, right? Then you could place each of the even numbers in a one-to-one correspondence with the original set of natural numbers, right? So that shows you that you can do that with the natural numbers. Shows you that set is an infinite set, it's a completed infinity. So any set where you can do that, that's what we mean by a completed infinity. So in some sense, there's a kind of straightforward mathematical definition of what that is. Now, a potential infinite is not quite so straightforward what that means as in a mathematical sense, right? It means something like an ever increasing set, right? It's always can always increase further without limit. There's no stopping point. So imagine counting. You just keep counting and keep counting and keep counting. There's no limit to how many numbers you can count. But the number of numbers that you will have counted at any one point is always going to be finite. But you can always keep going. So in some sense, this is what Craig means by a potential infinite, something that's increasing towards infinity as a limit forever. Right? So here's the move, right? The idea is supposed to be, Craig says that an infinite past, an endless past, is absurd, right? Because it would have these features of Hilbert's Hotel that you were talking about before. The response is something like, well, don't you believe, Craig, in a never-ending afterlife, right? Don't you think that eventually you're going to die and go to heaven, and then you're going to be in heaven forever in whatever kind of rapturous state, or perhaps, I mean, unlucky you end up in hell, but either way around, you're going to be somewhere forever, right? Kind of never-ending. Isn't there going to be an endless future ahead of us, just like there's a beginningless past behind us? And if there was something absurd about there being a beginningless past, surely there should be something absurd about there being an endless future as well, right? So it seems like there's a kind of inconsistency there. You can't, on the one hand, argue that the past can't be infinite because an infinite thing would be absurd, but at the same time say that, well, the future's infinite, but there's nothing absurd about that, right? So the accusation is supposed to be, how do you have that cake and eat it at the same time? And Craig's move there is to say, well, look, a beginningless series would be a completed infinity, but an endless future series would only be a potential infinity. And he says, well, there's really nothing absurd about a potential infinity, right? Potential infinity is always finite. At any step, it's always finite. So there's nothing absurd there. That's the response. And that's where the argument that me and Morriston were playing around with kicks in at that point. So I don't want to just give a lecture. I mean, does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So, because he's saying there's just nothing objectionable with the idea that the universe began to exist a finite time ago and can go on, quote unquote, infinitely into the future. But there's nothing problematic that's going to arise there. But we can't do that in the other direction. We can't move backwards like that. And that's so you're saying, look, consistency would say, well, why can it go this way and not that way?
Right. And so there's certain things that Craig says which he tries to motivate the idea that there's an asymmetry, right? So what Craig's after is a symmetry breaker. It's kind of the technical term, that there's something different about past and the future, and that difference makes it such that there's nothing absurd about a never-ending series of future events, but that there is something absurd about a never-beginning set of past events, right? Even though on their face they seem like they're just kind of symmetric to one another. At least that's the intuition that me and Morriston share. So what we're doing is dealing with his attempts at making a symmetry breaker, right? So he says various things that try and motivate that. I suppose the core of the argument runs, so there's a mathematical kind of model that we use to show that in some sense you can't have, I think this is the core of the argument. In some sense, mathematically, you can't have a potential infinite without an actual infinite. And this is what Craig's doing, is kind of pretending that you can just have a potential infinite and forget about the actual infinite that kind of necessarily corresponds to it. Let me see if I can explain this argument. It is mathematical, but it's very straightforward, really. It's just sometimes it's difficult to paint a mathematical argument completely in the medium of audio without any kind of whiteboard to explain this further.
Sure.
Let me see if I can do this. So what we need is simply just the idea of a function, right, which is very straightforward. It just means it's a mathematical rule, essentially, that takes something as an input and gives you something as an output, right? So it's an in-out machine, if you like. And we're going to look at two different functions. one which we'll call the C function for the Craig function, and one which we'll call the M function for Morriston function. Right. So the idea is that let me set this up a little bit before we get stuck into the maths. Right. That in the dialectic, Morriston's got this thought experiment of imagine that there'd been a demon who is cursing his fate one interval of time, one regular interval of time after another. Right. So he says at T0 he says a curse, and then at T1 he says another curse, and at T2 he says another curse. Right. And the idea is just that this immortal being, the demon who's like stuck in hell or something, is just cursing his fate. Right. He does nothing else than just do that. And the idea is, well, I mean, on Craig, or not necessarily Craig's, but on anyone's view, according to which the future is never ending, this demon's going to be saying curses forever, right? And now here's where the distinction between the functions kicks in. Obviously, Craig's going to say, well, at any moment you pick, the number of curses that the demon will have said is going to be finite. Right? The number of demons that he will have said at any one point will be finite. And Morriston's reply is that, well, the number of curses yet to be said is always infinite, right? And that's where the move comes in. So let's make this mathematical, right? So take the natural numbers, right, from 0, whole positive integers, right the way up to infinity, right?
Yep.
Now, take a function, the C function. What Craig is insisting on is it's a function that takes a single number as its input, and it gives you back a set of numbers. And the set of numbers is all numbers that are less than or equal to the input. So if I take 2 as the input, the set of numbers that I get back as the output is going to be 0, 1, and 2. Right? It's going to be a finite set with 3 elements in it. So fairly straightforward, I think. So the C function, whatever input you put into it, the output is always going to be finite. And that's like Craig saying the number of curses that the demon will have said is always going to be finite. Right? No matter what time you ask him how many curses he said, he's always going to give you a number of curses which is finite. And no matter how long he curses for, that's never going to turn into, he's never going to say, oh, I've suddenly completed the infinity and I've suddenly said infinite curses. He's always going to have only said a finite number of curses. But then, so the other function, the M function, it's very straightforward. It's just another input takes a single number as an input, and the output's going to be a set of numbers again. But the rule for this is just that the set of numbers that you get in the output function is a set of numbers that are strictly greater than the input function, the input number. So if we take 2 as the input number, then it's going to be all of the numbers greater than 2, right? So it's going to be 3, 4, 5, 6, blah, 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 all the way up to infinity. You can see that any number you put in to the M function, whether it's 2 or 10 million or whatever, the output you're going to get is always going to be a set of numbers which can be put in a one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. Right? It's going to be an infinite set, completed actual infinity. Right? Just as the output of the C function is going to be finite, the output of the M function is always going to be an actual infinity. So what this shows is that as the value of this C function increases towards infinity as a limit, right, it's a potential infinite, there's always, by definition, an M function that's hanging around with it for which the output is an actual completed infinity. And that is just a very, very straightforward, simple mathematical proof, essentially. It's very straightforward. And in some sense, what it shows you is that you can't have a potential infinite without a corresponding actual infinite. And it just carries over into the curses case. So we just say, like, at any moment, how many curses will have been said? And the answer, whatever the number is going to be a finite number. But also, if you ask a different question, at any moment, how many curses are there yet to be said? The answer is going to be an actual completed infinity's worth of curses are still yet to be said, right? So you can't have it that there's the potential infinity increasing forever without limit unless there's a kind of inexhaustible well of future curses yet to be said. right, from which you can keep drawing members.
Wait, I'm sorry. Say that last thing again. I didn't hear what you said.
Well, so think about it like this. Imagine, so on the A theory that Craig is committed to.
Yeah, A theory of time.
Yeah.
Tensed view of time.
Right, exactly. So on that view, time is distinguished into three categories, right? The past, the present, and the future. And events start off being future, then they become present, then they become past, right? There's this kind of
temporal becoming.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And so the tenses work with that because you say something like, some event, let's call it P, starts off being true that it will be that P, right? Then it's true that it is that P, and then it's true that it was that P, right? That's why it's a tense theory of time, because we have these fundamental facts, and those facts they change, right? As you sit and wait for P to come along, it happens, then it receives itself into the past again.
Whereas on a tensed view of time, it would be like slices of bread is the way I think of it.
You mean on a tenseless view of time?
I'm sorry. Did I say tense?
You said tense, but yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah, tenseless view of time. All points on the timeline are equally real. There is no distinction between past, present, and future, right?
Yeah, that's basically right. I mean, that you can nuance this a little bit, but that's
I'm just, for people listening who don't know these things, I'm trying to at least say something about them.
Yeah. The difference between the A theory and the B theory is that on the A theory, you talk about events like the event of, say, going to the dentist, right? Which is, that event is future. It has the property of being future. Then it has the property of being present. And then it has the property of being past. But on the B theory, what you have is you relate pairs of events, right? So you say things like the morning where I'm worrying about going to the dentist is earlier than the afternoon where I'm at the dentist, right? So what happens is you've got a fundamental relationship between two events. And in some senses, that those relationships on the B theory don't change, right? I mean, even though from my perspective, it feels like going to the dentist happens and then recedes off into the past, it's still true that my being worried about the dentist in the morning is earlier than being at the dentist, right? That fact doesn't change. So on the B theory, the idea is it's not dynamic in that same way that it is on the A theory. You've got relations between pairs of events rather than properties of individual events. That's the clearest, best way to distinguish the A theory from the B theory.
That was brilliant. I have not heard that way of distinguishing the two theories before. That was fantastic.
Okay, good. So on this idea, what we're doing is we're saying, so we're thinking about it in terms of the A theory. So there's past, present, and future. And events start off having the properties of being future. Then they have the property of being present. Then they have the property of being past. Now, think about the demon as he's saying, he's cursing his fate, right? Each time he curses, he says a new curse. Well, you can think about it as a curse sort of moves from being in the future and jumps over into the present, and then it slips off into the past again, right? So for it to be true that the demon can continue to say curses without limit, ever increasing into the future without limit, there has to always be more future curses that can be moved across, if you like, from the future into the present, right?
Okay.
If there were no future curses left for the demon to say, that would mean that the demon had come to the end of time, right? So
yes,
for him to always be able to keep saying curses, it has to be that there's always future curses left to say, right? No matter how many curses he says, there always has to be more there, ready for him to say. So in some sense, if you just think about the future curses yet to be said, that set has a property that's very like the weird properties that Hilbert's Hotel was supposed to have, right? Because let's think about it. I'm removing one curse from the set of future curses and adding it to the set of past and present curses. But no matter how many I take out of the set of future curses, there's still the same number of curses left to be said. There's always the same exact number, which is an actual completed infinities worth. So no matter how many you subtract from that, there's always the same number left. And this is exactly the type of property that Craig thinks is so absurd. You can't take away elements from a set and have the same number of elements left, right? If a guest leaves Hilbert's hotel,
that's the reductio. He's saying that because you get that conclusion, that can't be right.
Right.
That's absurd.
Exactly, but the point we're making is that for his answer, which is that there's that the number of curses that the demon is saying is merely a potential infinite, that actually has as a kind of correlate to it that there's an actual infinite, which is the number of curses yet to be said, which has all these weird properties that he thinks Hilbert's hotel has. So in some sense, you can't have one without the other. So, you can say that, of course, the number of curses that have been said is a potential infinite, if you like, but it's sort of inescapable that what that means is that there's an actual infinite sort of just behind the scenes, constantly feeding the potential infinite as it grows forever, right? And that actual infinite has the absurd features that Craig makes so much out of. So in some senses, he's committed to that by taking this escape route.
So, Alex, do you know of any good objections to this argument that a potential infinite that goes on forever will lead to a completed infinity? Like, has Craig made any good objections or other quantum proponents?
Well, no. So let's just to be clear, the idea is not so. What the way that you said it then isn't what my claim was. So I'm not saying that the potential infinity at some point becomes a completed infinity. I don't think that happens, right? It never becomes a completed infinity. But I'm just saying that at every stage, even at the first stage, even before the first stage, there's an actual infinity just there already on the scene, right? The set of future curses yet to be said. So it's not that the set of curses that have been said becomes a completed infinity. It doesn't. But there's always a set of future curses yet to be said, which is always an actual infinity. So,
right.
Yes, okay. And no, I don't think there's any good objections to this argument because I haven't seen this exact argument in print before. So I'm not sure that the philosophical community's had enough time to cook up. And it probably is, I don't know, seems pretty straightforward to me that this argument works. But what Craig says at several points, I don't think work. So sometimes Craig says things like, that he's a presentist, and a presentist is a kind of slightly, it's not quite the same distinction as the A theory and the B theory. The presentist is someone who says that only the present moment exists, right? And that both the past and the future don't exist. And, that's the one that feels most like what our phenomenology is like, right? Arguably, that we really only perceive the present, and you can't perceive the future or the past. You can anticipate the future and you can remember the past, but in some senses that those are experiences that are going on in the present as well. So if Craig is a presentist, he can say, look, there are no future events, right, because only the present exists. And this move has been made and exposed already by different people in the literature. There's a great paper by a guy called Landon Hendrick, which I recommend to people, which maybe I can send to you so you can link it in.
Yes, for sure, in the description.
So, but basically what he's pointing out there is just it's very straightforward that, you can't, if you're a presentist, then, the past doesn't exist either. So there's nothing absurd, this beginningless past doesn't exist either, right? So there's nothing.
Right. It's not a symmetry breaker.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Oh, I see. That's,
Right. So sometimes Craig will say, well, what about the moving block or the growing block theory, right? Which is the idea that, look, what's past and what's present are real, and the future is not real. Right? The future is kind of mere potentiality, as opposed to the present and the past, which are kind of fixed and determined.
This is kind of a hybrid A-B theory, sort of.
Yeah. What this has got going for it is that this theory mirrors some kind of fundamental asymmetry that we've got in time, or maybe not fundamental, but some kind of asymmetry that's very noticeable. It might be entropy, is what it's picking up. It might be the asymmetry of the way that we come to know facts, which might be the same asymmetry as entropy. But there's obviously something about the past which is more knowable to me than the future. So in particular, the things that are unknowable about the future are contingent things. So if I flip a coin, I can't know in advance whether it's going to land heads or tails, right? Barring some kind of super omniscience about exactly what's the microphysical property of everything, right? in some senses, it's kind of contingent to me, and unknowable for that reason, whether the coin's going to land heads or tails. But a past flip of the coin is completely different, right? I can just easily know whether the coin I flipped 2 minutes ago landed heads, right? So I have access to past contingencies, and I certainly don't have access to future contingencies, because otherwise, I'd go off and win the lottery or whatever tomorrow. So there is an asymmetry here, and then maybe this is the thing that Craig can appeal to in order to make the case here. But there's several things you can say that undercut this potential symmetry breaker. I mean, the first one is that, so I like this one, right? So you can say, you can make a distinction, right? Which I guess it's a distinction I already drew, but you can distinguish between there not being any future events because we've arrived at the final event, right? And time is about to come to an end. And you can distinguish between that and the view that there aren't any future events, but there will be, right? So obviously, so we distinguish between those two. We can call the first one the apocalyptic person as opposed to the kind of the presentist view, right? So Craig is a presentist, but he's not an apocalyptist, right? He doesn't think that this very moment is the last one. So when he says there are no future moments, he's still committed to the idea that there will be. And you can draw this distinction in the A theory. So there's a certain type of logic which goes along with the A theory called tense logic, and in that you have operators that are tenses like will be and was, and you can show that there's a formula which is true if you're at the final moment, or a formula which is true if there will be a final moment. It's basically it's that it will be that it's not the case that it will be that P, and that's true if there is a final moment. Right? It's basically saying that at some point it won't be that there will be any other things. Right? If that's true, then that means that there's a last moment. And I think that Craig thinks that formula is false because he thinks that there's a life ever after. It's never going to stop. Right? There won't ever actually be a final moment. So when he says that there are no future moments because of this asymmetry, he's drawing growing block theory. He's obviously not going to be he's not endorsing this apocalyptic formula. Right? What he's doing is saying there aren't right now any future moments. But when you start to say it like that, well, that's really obvious that there aren't now future moments. But because he's committed to the fact that there will be future moments, we can still say, how many curses will the demon say? Right? How many future moments will there be? And the only sensible answer to that is, well, there's always going to be more future moments, right? Because this potential infinity is increasing towards the future without limit. So there always has to be more future curses or more future moments yet to happen. So even if you say that those moments don't exist now, as long as you're careful to draw the distinction between being a presentist and someone who believes that this is the very last moment, you can still show that Craig is committed to there being true that there will be more future moments. So I don't think that appeal works either. Does that make sense? I'm happy to try and explain that better if that wasn't clear.
I'm not sure how that will lead to the implication that there are actually infinitely many things at any given time that exist. There will always be more, but at any given time, even in the future, the whole history will be finite, maybe. So, yeah,
That's
I'm
true.
not sure.
So the claim isn't that at any one point an infinite number of things exists. I don't think that that's necessarily true. The claim is just that on the A theory, the future has to be if the series. So think about the demon's praises. It's true that at any moment the number of praises that the demon will have said will be a finite number. So I'm not saying that at any point there'll be an infinite number of curses that have been said. Mm-hmm. But the thought is that there's you can still think about and quantify over the number of praises that are yet to be said, that will be said. And that has to be considered as a completed infinity. So Does that make sense? I mean, I'm trying to sell this, but please tell me if you've...
Yeah. So I have a question, and maybe in asking the question, it can help clarify some points, maybe. So we're talking about the second premise where the universe began to exist because there can't be this endless set of, events. And so Craig says that there's philosophical arguments for this premise and there's cosmological arguments for this premise. We're focusing on the philosophical arguments for this premise.
Mm-hmm.
But so would you say that one of the objections that you're trying to push with this is that the universe didn't begin to exist, that there is, or are you just saying it's possible and that just this philosophical argument doesn't work for the conclusion the way Craig is saying it works?
Yeah, so Craig's saying that the past couldn't be beginningless because such a thing would have the absurd features of Hilbert's Hotel. And notice that for that claim to work, Craig isn't making the claim that there currently exists, in any sense, like presently exists, any infinite collection of things, right? They're all past, right? So for an atheist, they don't all exist in any sense at the same time. They're in the past. But he thinks that's enough to be absurd anyway, right? It's sufficiently like Hilbert's Hotel for it to be absurd. And I mean, you could argue that there's a disanalogy between Hilbert's Hotel and this anyway, which you were talking about before. Oppie's point about, you can't, I mean, for Hilbert's Hotel to be absurd, it has to be such that guests check in and check out, right? You have to be able to say things like, well, it's full, but let's get everyone to shuffle up one room and we've managed to find a room, right? And that seems like it's weird and absurd, or, ask a bunch of all the even-numbered guests to leave, and there's still an infinite number of guests there, even though you've taken away an infinite number of guests, right? These examples are supposed to be absurd. But, you can't take away moments of time, right? At least on the A-theory one, temporal passage goes in one direction. And that's a metaphysical fact, if anything's a metaphysical fact, supposedly. So if that's true, then, I mean, what are you talking about when you're saying, drawing an analogy here? Like, how can guests, it's a Hilbert's Hotel that guests can't check out of, right? So how can it make any of these absurd features? This is Oppie's point. And I think it's pretty good. It seems to me that's pretty good. It's just disanalogous, right? It's in some sense a passive infinity, the past, even if it's completed infinity. So, that's another way of attacking it.
Okay. John just joined us, and now that we got John with us, John, go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hi, Alex. Name's John Lapalato. I go by. I was going by Counter Apologist on YouTube and on the internet. Glad to be able to join you guys. I've been struggling to get here. I was listening actually, and I did want to ask a question. You were talking about how Craig might be committed to an infinite number of future events. Mm-hmm. And I thought another possible way he might be committed to an actual infinite number of things. One of them would be Craig is a Molinist, in terms of he talks about how God basically envisioned all possible out of all possible worlds that exist, God actualizes the world in which a person freely chooses to do any action, so to speak, right? And so we still freely make the action, the choice, but God actualizes the world where we do, whatever choice happens to be, right? For the entire set of people. But given his commitment to that, it seems to me there would be an actual infinite number of possible worlds. It could be, forever, however many people there are that exist, you could always have, one more, so to speak. And so there would always be almost an infinite number of permutations of free choices that, or whatever this total set of people who will get created or could be created. And so this would be an actual infinite number of facts that God would have to know, or an actual infinite amount of kind of factuals.
Yeah. So Craig's response to the idea. So there's a whole bunch of objections in the literature about that are versions of the God knows infinite things objection, right? So like, God knows all of the answers to every mathematical like equation, right? So we can think of like, we could line them up, right? Like 1 + 1, 1 + 2, 1 + 3. For each of those, God knows what the answer is. So, and it's not just like he's constantly doing more and more sums. And, it's not a potential infinity. He's not finding them out. He knows them all, right? So it's a completed infinity. Therefore, God knows infinite things. Therefore, God's a completed infinity. Therefore, God's like Hilbert's Hotel, so God can't exist, right? That's the general gist of these types of arguments. I think that's the way you're going with this. God has to know this sprawling, infinite landscape of possibilities. So each one of those is something that God knows. So God knows an infinite number of things, blah, 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 right? So I think Craig's response is to say that God just doesn't have propositional knowledge at all. He doesn't know. He just has one kind of unified kind of vision of everything at once, and it's not split into propositions in any way. So he takes this kind of Thomistic view, but yeah, he kind of just points a bit at one of the traditional views of God's knowledge, which is that it's non-propositional, and just says, well, it might be like that. So that's how he gets
propositional.
Yeah.
So, wow.
It seems almost analogous to how a B theorist would conceive of time, almost. Basically, the idea, like a B theorist would think, if you were a B theorist, you would think that there is no such thing as the present. There would basically be the past and the future. There are basically points in time, and there is no such thing as the past going out of existence. I'm sorry?
Earlier than now and later than now, right?
Right. But so if you're like a space-time realist, the future is as real as the past is, ontologically speaking, right? There is, like if you're a block theorist of time, like the past moment in time never went out of existence. They just all kind of exist all together.
I see. And so you're saying that Craig's response by saying that God has knowledge non-propositionally is a bit like that, because he just sort of apprehends all of it as a big unified whole rather than like in portioned out into little bits. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I suppose in some sense that analogy is it's not bad as an analogy for explaining the point. And Craig, I think, uses I think it's Alston and Alston's one of Craig's big kind of influences. And Alston himself uses a model that I think possibly Bradley, who's the guy who came up with the A theory and the B theory in the first place.
It's not McTaggart?
Oh, sorry, yeah, it was McTaggart. Right? Bradley and McTaggart were in this school of like British idealism. And so they held to this type of picture. So I think you're right, it's McTaggart's paradox, obviously, but so I think it's Bradley's idea of this, and I don't fully understand this. It doesn't really make much sense to me. But the idea, the analogy is supposed to be like this: look, you can behold a painting, right, and take it all in as one unified whole. Right, and that's the way that God's knowledge is supposed to be. Right? It's not proposition, not broken up into little bits. So he just apprehends all of the painting, as it were, all at the same time. And of course, you can focus in on each individual brush stroke if you like and think about it like that. But you certainly don't have to, and that's not the way that God apprehends it. Maybe we are stuck, looking at one brush stroke at a time or something, but God kind of beholds the whole totality in all of its magnificence and sort of sees and understands it all as one. I'm not sure.
It seems to me that even if you were to say that, wouldn't it be true that there's still an infinite number of brushstrokes in the whole?
Yeah, I thought the objection was supposed to be that it's to do with God knowing the collection, right? So this type of objection is that God's knowledge is somehow an infinite collection, and that makes God impossible on Craig's view. That's how these arguments are supposed to run. So you're saying something like, well, look, there's an infinite number of possible worlds, right? So that infinite number of possible worlds itself is something that's infinite, and therefore that couldn't exist. And I think Craig might just say, yeah, you know what, it doesn't really exist, right? Only the actual world, it really exists. Those worlds, they're not real, right? He's not committed to them being real in the same way that he is to the actual world being real. So he'll just say, sure, yeah, that's true. They're possible worlds, but they're not actual. Right? They're not concrete.
Right. Yeah, they're not part of our ontology, so to speak. They don't have ontologically weighty features. They're just merely possible.
So in order for the objection to work, it would have to be God's knowledge of those worlds or those possibilities, which the objection would get around, I see.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's if you're trying to pose the objection in the way I thought you were in the first place, yeah, you're trying to pin the absurd property on God himself and saying, I mean, that's what's nice about this type of argument is it's supposed to say, well, look, Craig, you know, on your view, God himself is impossible. You know, how do you like damn apples kind of thing? But like,
really? Should that be the subtitle of the paper?
But I think he's, you know, that type of move where he says, well, what if God's knowledge is non-propositional? It kind of sweeps away most of those versions of the argument, right? Because unless you've got some really good way of explaining why it couldn't be non-propositional and it has to be propositional, it's hard to know. It's hard to see how that objection is going to stick. So yeah.
I find it so strange. I know I'm kind of going off topic here, but just saying that God couldn't have propositional knowledge. And now I've always thought that, you know, there's these two kinds of knowledge. There's propositional knowledge, and then there's knowledge by acquaintance. So knowledge by acquaintance is knowledge by like our experiences. So like I know what it's like to go skydiving or something. I know what it's like to taste strawberries. That's not propositional knowledge. It's knowledge by acquaintance. Well, most theologians would kind of press back and say, well, maybe God, as part of his omniscience, doesn't have all knowledge by acquaintance. He might not know what it's like, you know, to die.
He doesn't know what it's like to sin, yeah.
Yeah, or something like that. But he would have all proposition knowledge, meaning he would know all true propositions. So then if you take that off the table, well, then what does it even mean to say God has knowledge? Like, it's not propositional knowledge, it's not knowledge by acquaintance, but it's just all of it.
But, I mean, I think that the move is to say human knowledge and divine knowledge are just not analogous. Well, the only sense in which they're similar is by analogy. So you can't speak of this move, you can't talk univocally about divine knowledge. It's just different from human knowledge. So humans only have two types of knowledge. God's got this other one, which is kind of divine apprehension or something, where he just beholds everything or whatever, right? So, I mean, you know, there's really no limits to your imagination when you're thinking about what God could be like. So, I mean, it could be like that for all I know.
Right. That's how I get out of the idea of how a autonomous mind could exist. It seems almost equivalent to saying there's a spaceless mountain. I think it's Stephen Law's analogy. And I just don't see how. I mean, it almost seems to me like the fact that the universe is a finite theoretically is almost as much a problem because, you know, why isn't it older or younger? Like, if God eternally willed to create the universe, or he willed from eternity to create the universe, how come the universe isn't as old as God? Right?
I don't know. Yeah,
that just seems.
I've actually taken that question head on.
I can tell you what Craig's answer is to that, which is that roughly anyway, he distinguishes between a relational and an absolute view of time. One way to think about that is the difference between a Newtonian and a Leibnizian view of time. But on the Newtonian view, time is like a kind of fish tank or something, in which it's a container in which events are situated, and they have their position in a kind of absolute sense, right? So, so on the Newtonian view, you might have it that there's, say, some period of empty time, like 100 years or something, and then the first physical event takes place, right? and then stuff kicks off from that. And then maybe there's some period where everything freezes for like 100 years, and then everything kicks off again. And there's that like 100-year period where nothing's happening in the middle is because there's the kind of absolute frame of time just shows that there's an empty space there, right? On the relational view, the time is just the distance between events. So like you can't have it. It doesn't make any sense to say that there's no physical events, and then after 100 years, the first physical event takes place. All there is just like there's the first physical event, and then there's like the 50th physical event after that. It's just 50 units of event or something later on. Right? We're just talking about the relations between events rather than one event having a reference in relation to this kind of absolute container of time. So the idea there is supposed to be that it doesn't make any sense to even ask the question, why didn't God create the universe 5 minutes earlier than he did? Time starts when God makes the universe, right? There is no time. There's no like dynamic movement of time before that. God creates time when that happens because Craig's got a relational view of time, and when the first event is created, that's when time starts. So he thinks the question of why doesn't God make the universe 5 minutes earlier is meaningless. And Leibniz said that the question of why does the universe not start 5 minutes earlier is also meaningless, right? It doesn't make any sense. Whereas on the Newtonian view, that's supposed to be a kind of coherent question. So Craig's helping himself to a reasonably well-established distinction. Not to say that we know that time is relational, but it's at least on the table as a way of talking about these things.
I see.
Huh. I didn't know any of that.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's very good.
So again coming back to the philosophical scientific distinction, nothing that you're arguing for here butts up against contemporary cosmology, right? Right.
Absolutely. I'm not saying anything about contemporary cosmology whatsoever.
So I'm saying like a rebuttal couldn't be, well, if this is what, the view, if you're going to take this view, then you're just going against you're just rejecting contemporary cosmology.
No, so let's say contemporary cosmology suggests that the universe had a beginning. I'm not 100% convinced that is what contemporary cosmology says, but let's say that that's what it says. And let's even strengthen that so that contemporary cosmology proved that there had to be a beginning. That wouldn't change anything about what I'm saying either. I'm just simply saying that Craig's reason for showing that the universe had to have a beginning, the philosophical argument, doesn't work on its own right. There might be other reasons, and cosmology might say that there had to be, but this argument, and specifically the argument was about that, it would be an actual, the argument is that it would make an actual infinity, and an actual infinity is absurd. Now, I have objections to that. I mean, I'm just not sure it's absurd for the type of OPI reasons we were talking about before. I just don't see what's so absurd about it. On the other hand, what's really going on is that I'm saying even more nuanced than that. One of Craig's reasons for rebutting, so I started off by saying, look, if Craig wants to rule out the beginningless past as being absurd, then surely he should rule out the endless future as being absurd as well, right? But if he's committed to the afterlife never ending, then he seems to be having one actual infinite and not saying that that's absurd, but ruling out another one and saying that that's absurd. So that's where the dialectic comes in. It's really the question is, can you sustain, is there a relevant symmetry breaker to have that kind of view? Or do you have to throw away the endless future as if you throw away the beginningless past? That's what I'm saying is I think really he has to be consistent. There isn't a relevant symmetry breaker, essentially. That's my claim.
I feel like heaven ends up throwing in some pretty big thorns in regards, like, because you're right. It does. If he believes in heaven, then he's got this problem there, like you said. But if he doesn't believe in heaven, that problem goes away, right? Like if he says, "Look, I believe in this perfect being, but I'm no longer a Christian theist, and I don't think there is an heaven," this problem doesn't arise. That.
Sure. He could say, well, look, by heaven, I don't mean... so I assume what he means by heaven is a potentially like an endless series. What he's going to say, it's a potential infinite, right? I mean, he more or less doesn't relate it to heaven, but he does say specifically that there's nothing absurd about an endless future. And the thought would be he's doing that because he's theologically committed to it. On the other hand, he could just shrug his shoulders and say, do you know what, actually, yeah, the future has to come to an end as well. That's what happens in the end of times or whatever. Maybe he chooses that theology. And then he might say, look, heaven doesn't mean a never-ending sequence of pleasurable events, and hell doesn't mean a never-ending sequence of painful events. In fact, heaven is just one unified union with God or something, right? And hell just means one disunion with God or something like that, right? And it's not an infinite sequence. In which case, that my argument goes off the table. I'm just assuming that it doesn't.
So one thing that I can think of is I think it was an interview that Craig did with Robert Kuhn on the Closer to the Truth show on PBS, where he talks about how once God created time, he can't end it. I think because I'm trying to remember the exact argument. I think he said it results in kind of a contradiction. If God were to end time. Unfortunately, I can't remember the specifics. I almost might have to leave that for the listener to look up on YouTube.
That's interesting, though.
But I'm pretty sure he was committed to the idea that once time has been created, it couldn't be ended without it. Basically would be logically impossible to end it without there being some kind of a logical contradiction.
Yeah, and he also said something like God, like the cause and its effect are simultaneous.
Yes, he is committed to absolute simultaneity. Yeah, he's committed to that.
God is outside of time prior to creation and comes inside of time at the same moment of creation.
Yeah, that's how he gets around the causes preceding their effects, which I think is something that I don't think works particularly well with general relativity.
Alex, what do you think is the strongest objection? So you're saying I know it hasn't really been on the street long enough, but what do your biggest worry about your argument?
Well, the way I predict, say the paper gets accepted and Craig responds in print, my prediction is that we tried to anticipate this a bit, but I think he's still going to say something like this. The future is merely potentiality, right? Remember what I was saying about Craig doesn't believe that all possible worlds exist, right? He just thinks they're just merely possible, right? I think he's going to say the same thing about the future. He's going to say, listen, they're always, the way that future events can be said to exist is as mere potentialities, right? Possibilities in some sense or another. They're not actual, they're possible. And there's a danger here of running together and misunderstanding, of running together the idea of the distinction between being possible and being actual, and the difference between a completed infinity, which is often called an actual infinity, and a potential infinity, right? Those two things have similar words in them, but then have nothing to do with each other, right? And you can talk about the future being potential in this kind of Aristotelian sense in which possibility resides in the future. That's fine. That's an established kind of metaphysical view. But the sense in which the future is merely potential and not actual isn't the same as the distinction between. It's got nothing to do with having parts that can be laid in one-to-one correspondence with their proper subparts or whatever. It's nothing to do with that. So there's a danger of conflating those two things. But what I think he's going to say is that even though in some senses there's always got to be future events ready to become present events and then to become past, that well of future events doesn't exist. So he's not committed to it existing. It's merely potential. And that diffuses the charge that he's committed to there be existing something which is actually infinite. I think that's probably the way that the dialectic is run. All we're doing is refining the very same point over and over again. And that's pretty much the way he likes to run this already. So we tried to anticipate that a little bit. And the paper might change as it goes through review. So it might be different by the time it comes out. But at the moment, we have a section where we try and anticipate that. What if the future is merely potentiality? So one of the things Craig, as we talked about before, Craig's committed to the idea that Craig's a Molinist, right? So God knows all counterfactual truths about what agents would do if they'd been in different circumstances. But he also, according to Molinism, God also knows what agents will in fact end up choosing to freely do, right? So God already knows what's going to happen, right? It might not be propositional knowledge, but it's still, there is some sense in which it's determinate what's going to happen, because God already knows that. And that seems to me anyway, that that's enough to say that there's such a thing as the actual future, that you can't really consider the future merely a bundle of potentiality. If, let's say I'm going to flip a coin, right? It could land heads, it could land tails, right? Both are possible. But actually God knows in advance which way it's going to land, right? So one of them really is actual in advance anyway. So it already makes, the extent of the actual world for Craig, it seems to me, it already extends into the future, right? Because God knows what contingent things are going to happen. So,
well, it's not that the future actually exists, but that there are actual truths now about what the future will be like.
Yeah,
right.
That's right. So the idea that you can just say, well, the future's all indeterminate and merely potential, doesn't really work if you believe that God knows which way all the possible coin flips are going to land. Seems to be that you're committed to kind of slither of actuality extending into the future amongst all of the possible ways that it might go. That view is sometimes called the thin red line, which is like the idea that if you drew all of the possibilities as a branching tree in front of this moment now, one of those possible futures is sort of distinguished in red, and that's the one that God can anticipate and knows is going to happen. So it seems to me that diffuses somewhat the idea that Craig can just sort of shrug his shoulders and say, listen, I'm not committed to any of these things existing on the basis that the future is just potentiality. It doesn't seem like we're wandering off into sort of slightly uncharted territory here. It's not quite clear whether that response is decisive or whether my response to that response is decisive either. I'm kind of having to anticipate to some extent.
Here we would get into what's known as the truth maker problem of how there can be truths about the future when there are no future objects. And I think the normal response that metaphysicians of time make is that there are forward-looking properties that are instantiated by present objects or past objects, I guess, if it's a growing block theory, that ground the truth of things about the future. And so it could be true that there will always be more moments in the future, but that doesn't mean that there are infinitely many things in the present or past. There could be just finitely many forward-looking properties that make that true, or I don't know exactly how it would work.
I see what you mean. And I don't think I need it to be that there are infinitely many things in the present or past for the objection to work. There could be finitely many things in the present and past. But so long as the future is never going to end, so say the future is an actual infinite in that case. So it's not that there are infinitely many things that do exist, but it's that there are infinitely many things that will exist. And that's bad enough, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it is a problem. I mean, if he also thinks that a beginningless past is absurd, even if the past doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So exactly, and so it's this trying to. It feels to me like that it's sort of there's some kind of air of desperation on. I feel like Craig's on the run here a little bit in the sense that he's trying to find some way of plugging this gap. Right, he thinks there's got to be some way of making a symmetry breaker here. Something must tell the difference between why the infinite past is absurd, but the infinite future isn't. and all of the ways that he proposes so far that I know of, things like, well, the future doesn't really exist, or the future is just mere potentiality, or you can't count to infinity. These are the main things that he suggests. None of them, it seems to me, really do anything to diffuse the claim, because if we go back to the mathematical example I was saying at the beginning, it doesn't make sense logically. It doesn't make any sense to have a function that takes input and spits out output, such that it's a potential infinite. If you have a function that's like that, I can show you that it follows logically that there's another function which works just like it, but which always has an actual completed infinity as its output. And that mathematical result, seems to me, means that we're only ever going to be hand-waving away some kind of escape route. It's not going to be a hard, proper refutation. It's going to be Craig saying, well, yeah, but, maybe if metaphysics-y kind of solution-y thing works like this, but really there's always going to be another way of packaging out the objection that I think me and Morriston are outlining, because there's a hard mathematical result underneath it. So, it might just become increasingly nuanced and uninteresting to the general audience, but I don't suppose he's ever going to find a very convincing way out of this, seems to me.
Yeah, well, let's try to anticipate one more reply. So let's say Craig just retracts the claim that a beginningless past is absurd, even if it doesn't exist.
Okay.
Then is there a problem still with his argument?
No, but I think then that I think what that does is this premise of the Kalam is usually given two philosophical supports, and also support from cosmology. This one is that an actual infinity can't exist. It's impossible. If he made the retraction you were suggesting, that would be basically to concede that argument. That would leave just the other philosophical argument, which is that an actual infinity can't be generated by a successive addition, which I think is a worse argument than the one we're fighting with here anyway. So to me, it leaves the argument almost entirely resting on cosmology at that point. And I think no one can really say with any. I mean, ask a cosmologist what they think is the answer to whether or not the universe is finite towards the past, and they might tell you what they think. But ask them to bet their house on that. I don't think anyone would do that. Things have changed so much in the last 100 years in cosmology. Who knows, really? So even if cosmology currently supports it being finite towards the past, it could all change in the future. So if the Kalam completely rests on cosmology, I think it's on rather shaky ground altogether. That's why Craig has philosophical arguments as well.
Right.
So we've been going for about an hour now, and so this will kind of a great segue into a final question. What do you think is the strongest objection to the Kalam? What do you see as just the big thorn in the side of that argument? You can only pick one. You only pick
I
one.
can only pick one.
You only pick one. So make it good.
Well, I suppose, I've already mentioned it, but I rather like Oppie's rebuttal to the idea that the past being infinite only really manifests anything that looks like absurdity if it's active rather than passive. And it seems quite straightforwardly to be passive. Like you can't change the past. That seems to be as certain a metaphysical truth as any. But that's what the argument requires for it to generate anything that looks even remotely absurd. I suppose another way of looking at this is that there is a kind of just simply like adopting the correct linguistic procedure seems to be able to diffuse most of the absurdities as well. And so you said this was the final question, so I'll try and make this quite brief. But so there's the idea that what you're doing when you say remove a book from the infinite library, only to find that there's still the same number of books in the infinite library as there were before you removed the book. the idea is that is in some sense supposed to be analogous to subtraction in mathematics. But what mathematicians will tell you is that the notion of subtraction in transfinite arithmetic is undefined. Right? It doesn't make any sense to say that. So there's some kind of question mark over the legitimacy of the analogy between picking up a book and taking it off an infinite shelf and the notion of subtraction in mathematics. And it seems like there's kind of need this analogy to work for the absurdity to follow, because here's how it works. So on the one hand, you've got kind of this clash of two principles. Right? One of them is called Hume's principle, and that basically says that if you take any two sets, if you compare every member of one set for each member of one set, you compare it to a unique member of the other set, then you have two sets that have the same number of elements in. So take the knives and the forks in my cutlery set, right? For each knife, I compare it with a unique fork until I've got no knives left over, right? And that shows you that, and no forks left over. And that fact that I compare them up like that is what it means for them to have the same number. There's the same number of forks as there are knives. And saying, well, what does having the same number means? It means I can do this procedure, I compare them. So that's Hume's principle, is that if you can put things into a one-to-one correspondence, that's what it means for them to have the same number. And then you've got this other thing sometimes called Euclid's maxim, which is that if you take a set and you take a subset of that, a proper subset of that set, then the proper subset has fewer elements in than the original set. So if I take the cutlery set and I just take away the spoons, right? The spoons is a proper subset of the cutlery set. And that means that there's fewer spoons than there are items in the cutlery set. Right? If it's a proper subset, that means there's fewer than the whole. In other words, the part is smaller than the whole. The proper part is smaller than the whole. And well, you can avoid Craig's charge of absurdity by just dropping one of these, basically. And that's kind of what happens when you get to transfinite arithmetic, when you're talking about infinities. Really what happens is that Euclid's maxim just goes, right? With an infinite set, the proper part isn't necessarily smaller than the whole, right? The even numbers is a proper part of the natural numbers, but it's not small. There's not fewer even numbers than there are natural numbers. There's the same number, according to Hume's principle. So if we keep Hume's principle but drop Euclid's maxim, there's no contradiction. On the other hand, you could do it the other way around. You could keep Euclid's principle but drop Hume's maxim and just simply give up the idea that if you can, even though you compare the natural numbers with the even numbers, that still doesn't mean that they're the same amount, right? You could just hold on to the idea that the even numbers is obviously fewer than the natural numbers. You could just plant your flag in the sand at that point and not move it. And no one can make you inconsistent if you do that either. So really there's two strategies. You just have to kind of say that, one way of thinking about this is that when we got into mathematics and figured this stuff out properly, we realized that when you're thinking about transfinite mathematics, one of those two principles has to go. And, if Hilbert's Hotel was real, if there really was a Hilbert's Hotel in the universe somehow, somewhere, if we just went off in a spaceship for long enough and just found it, and, there's this dude and it says Hilbert's Hotel, and you ask him how many people are here, and he says there's infinite number of people here, and he just does all this stuff that Craig says is absurd, and you just see it and you go, well, that's weird. One way of thinking about what's going on there is that you've empirically discovered that Euclid's principle is not true. Right? That there is, in fact, somewhere in the universe where there's an object such that a proper part of it has the same cardinality to the whole. Right? That we thought that Euclid's principle was true in the actual world, but it's not universally true. Right? That could happen, and it seems to me that I can imagine it happening. And I just don't see what's wrong with. There's all sorts of crazy stuff in the world, right? Superpositions with these string theory, Trump, no one can say that they understand all of this properly. It seems to me that could just happen. And if it does, then, so what? There go all of these arguments. So I'll stop there. But it just seems to me that's one way of characterizing what I see as the kind of major flaw in this argument. It seems to me it's not absurd, even on its own terms.
Just a glaring problem there. Ben, did you have anything else?
Well, so you can say that there are things in the world we know exist that are weird, absurd, like quantum mechanics is really weird. But we have all this evidence that quantum mechanics is true.
Yeah.
And you might think we don't have as much evidence that there are actual infinities or that actual infinities are possible. Right.
Well, I don't have any evidence that an actual infinity exists, but I have no evidence either direction as to whether they're possible. They could be possible. I mean, I can imagine it being the case. I'm not saying it is the case. I can't support that claim, but I think all you need to do in the absence of evidence in either direction is just sort of explain what it would be like if that was to happen. And I think I just tried to explain it as clearly as I could, that if I empirically stumbled across Hilbert's Hotel, I wouldn't say, oh, I must have gone mad because Craig's arguments against this being metaphysically possible are so convincing that I've got mad. I would say, you know what, Craig was wrong, and I've somehow empirically discovered that, even though it didn't seem possible. People couldn't imagine it. It actually is the case. And, people couldn't possibly imagine the internal angles of a triangle adding up to more than 180 degrees. But basically, general relativity shows that is the case in certain parts of the actual world that we live in. On the outskirts of a black hole or whatever, space-time is warped to such an extent that that sort of thing is the case. When non-Euclidean geometry is very obvious there. So, Kant couldn't possibly imagine that. He thought Euclidean geometry was a priori true of the actual world. It just turns out we empirically discovered that it wasn't. I just think that when we don't know one way or the other, I think that I can perfectly well imagine what it would be like to come across Hilbert's Hotel, and I don't really see what the problem is there. I would just adopt a different kind of linguistic convention or something. I would just say, Hume's principle and Euclid's maxim don't go together, and Euclid's maxim goes.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap everything up. Alex Malpass, thank you so much for coming and talking with us about the Kalam. I will try to link the episode 19, which was the Kalam, into the description. If you're watching this on a podcast, check out episode 19. It's all about the Kalam. And this discussion hopefully has helped enlighten some people on both sides of the aisle as to some of the intricacies of the argument and places where we think that it's weak. So, Ben, do you have anything else to sign off?
Nope, just thanks for the discussion.
All right. Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much.
If you appreciate the tone and content of what Real Atheology has to offer, please consider writing a review for us on iTunes. All music was created by Work of Wolves.